Well, good afternoon, folks. If I hate to interrupt your nap, if it's nap time, I'm Jay Fitch with Fitch & Associates, and this afternoon we're going to be talking about building your ambulance to meet the new safety standards, and we want to acknowledge Furno sponsoring this session, and there are multiple presenters that are going to present, but we've also designed a fairly wide band of time to have direct interaction and some, to be able to entertain your questions as well. And your speakers this afternoon, your panel, Dia Gaynor served 27 years with the Idaho State EMS office. She was paroled for good behavior, or bad behavior, I might say, and now serves as the executive director of the National Association of State EMS Officials. Jim Green in the middle is actually a Navy guy who was in Aviation Systems Command, and then is now a researcher extraordinaire with the National Institute of Occupational Safety, or Occupational Health. Skip Kirkwood, the past president, the past president of the National EMS Management Association. He's an author, an attorney, and is the EMS director of Durham County EMS in North Carolina. And with that, Dia, I'm going to turn this over to you and keep us moving.
That's easy. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. This issue of ambulance design and safety overall for EMS personnel is a paramount concern to state EMS officials. Those are the members of our organization. And later in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about their perspective. But first, I want to make sure that everyone who's here is aware of new data and graphical analysis that's been performed by the NHTSA Office of Emergency Medical Services related to ground vehicle crashes. So if you're interested in looking for some information to understand some of the numbers, at least from a national perspective, the first thing to understand is where the data come from, and that's the Fatality Analysis Reporting System that's operated by the U.S. Department of Transportation, as is the National Automotive Sampling System General Estimates System. So these are the sources of the data that were used for the charts and graphs that I'll be showing you. Understand that both rely on the law enforcement officer's record that's completed at and after the crash involving an ambulance. So they pulled 20 years worth of records and found that on a per year basis, there were an average of 4,500 motor vehicle collisions or incidents involving an ambulance. Of these, 65% were property damage only, 34% resulted in one or more persons being injured, and less than 1% were fatals. The injuries and fatalities include not only all occupants in the ambulance, but also occupants in other vehicles or occupants outside the vehicles, such as pedestrians. So when you look at it broken down in 5-year chunks, dating back to 1992, this just displays that data in a little different way, showing fortunately how narrow the sliver is of fatal crashes. Nonetheless, that number on a every 5-year basis, seeing that it hovers around 1,500 crashes that produce one or more injured persons, I think is a pretty alarming number. NHTSA was also kind enough to do some other charts and graphs, drilling in just to those fatalities, that on a per year basis, there were 29 ambulance-involved collisions, yielding an average of 33 fatalities. And you'll notice that year 2005, that highest spike there, was attributed largely to a tractor trailer crashed into an ambulance with one driver and 4 occupants, and all 5 were killed. That number of 30 per year being killed in ambulance crashes, I find obscene. Hopefully the rest of you do too, because we will talk about the limitations of these data, and I will assert that I believe these numbers are low because of the source of the data. The estimated number of ambulance crashes resulting in injured persons, an annual average of 1,500 of those crashes that produce 2,600 injured persons per year in ambulance-involved collisions. This does not include crashes caused by an ambulance where the ambulance escaped being part of the collision. So keep that in mind as well. Who got killed? Well, 1/4 were inside the ambulance. The police reporting system, and I'll show you a little more information about that in a second, can isolate an individual as a driver, but the current police reporting system, both version 3 and version 4, that drives what most law enforcement officers use for that crash reporting, cannot distinguish among any of the other occupants. So it is impossible using today's law enforcement crash reports to tell the difference between the patient versus a crew member. The vast majority of the persons killed in crashes involving an ambulance were in another vehicle. So ambulance versus any vehicle smaller, obviously the ambulance generally wins. The similarly injured persons, this is kind of interesting how much bigger the proportion of when it's a non-fatal injury crash, the proportion of ambulance passengers and persons driving the ambulance is much greater. So the understandable questions the NHTSA's Office of Emergency Medical Services anticipated were, okay, well, how many of these happened while the vehicle was in emergency use? And that's about 58%, while 42% were in non-emergency use. And looking at the injury crashes, very similar breakdown, 60% while in emergency use and 34% while in non-emergency use. But anybody who works in the transportation industry will know that this is kind of not a meaningful way to measure this information, because the gold standard in the transportation industry, both in US DOT as well as your state departments of transportation, is to measure injury and death rates by vehicle miles traveled. And because we don't have the means of capturing odometer readings today from both the ambulances involved in crashes as well as ones that weren't involved in crashes, we can't execute those calculations. So this shows broken down by year, the non-emergency use, which you see in red, and I'm sorry, emergency use obviously in red, and non-emergency use is the blue line. So let's talk about the limitations of these data, because this is really important to sort of qualify anytime you share with somebody, hey, did you know over the 20-year period starting in 1992, there were an average of 29 ambulance-involved collisions that resulted in 1 or more fatalities? That you need to qualify that statement by recognizing out loud the limitations of those law enforcement officer reports. First of all, it only includes crashes that are customarily open to the public. Secondly, not all crashes are reported to law enforcement. Third, the law enforcement officers may not actually fill in the field that says this was an ambulance. If it's not a required field, or there's not some mistake-proofing checker to make sure that the type of vehicle had to be checked before the record was accepted at the state level, is a limitation. There is no further breakdown of ambulance for the law enforcement officer to mark what kind of ambulance it was, type 2, type 3, et cetera. It also does not capture whether in emergency mode or non-emergency mode, were they en route to an incident, or were they responding from a scene to a hospital. It also doesn't collect data showing the proportion of time any given ambulance is on the road. That gets to that vehicle miles traveled challenge. And it doesn't currently differentiate between who was where. This information is available at ems.gov. If you click on the banner that reads safety, you can download a presentation of PowerPoint that contains all of this information. It goes into a lot more details, subsets of information about the fatal crashes versus the injury crashes. And when we sort of talk about, well, what's the root cause here? How can we improve the quality of these data? It really comes down to something called, affectionately known as MUC, which is the Model Minimum Uniform Crash Criteria. This is the equivalent of the NEMSIS data dictionary that's in use by the agencies that decide what law enforcement officers' crash reports should look like. And I'll show you a diagram that we were successful getting added to the latest version of that document. There's also some resources out there you might want to look at, such as NHTSA's annual traffic safety facts. This diagram has now been added, and the format, the way it's set up, is the way all the other vehicle diagrams that have forever been in MUC are set up. So if you think it looks kind of weird, it's just built the way to match the other diagrams of school buses, vans, passenger cars, tractor-trailer cabs, et cetera. What we realized was this is really kind of complicated to capture who was where in the back of an ambulance. When you think about all the possible variations of who could be seated where, the different configuration types of various brands of ambulances, the fact that somebody could be seated in any number of 3 places as far as the bench seat is concerned, and so forth, that it forced us to sort of list 10 distinct unique positions, well, I should say 8 unique positions, unique to ambulances, after you get past what's common in all other vehicle types that are already included in that appendix of MUC, after you get past the driver and the front seat passenger. And believe it or not, it was a floor fight to get this included, even though there were already another 20-some vehicle diagrams like this in the existing document. The transportation and law enforcement community really pushed back hard. Hey, this is adding a lot of variation, this is adding a lot of stuff the law enforcement officer has to think about. And we had to go through 3 national public meetings and frankly, a slugfest to ultimately overcome the thinking in the room that this was important information, and that long term, if we were truly going to begin to understand and get any more meaningful information about what's happening to whom in the back of an ambulance, this was essential to include. So hopefully the use of that diagram is really sort of optional. The question goes straight to your state office of highway safety as your state adopts or makes a decision about adopting the latest version of MUC. The question you need to ask is, are we including the ambulance diagram? You want to seek active confirmation of that, because if the state does not choose to include that diagram, there's not a law enforcement officer in your state who's going to fill it out, because it's not going to appear on their form. I mentioned the NHTSA traffic safety facts is published on an annual basis. It's very interesting because then you can sort of put the ambulance crash problem in context with other comparative information about other motor vehicle crash types. And there's a boatload of resources to be had. So if you're in search of your next term paper or thesis, there's plenty of information and resources listed in those documents that you can turn to. So I'm going to sit down and turn it over to my colleague Jim Green.
Thank you, Dia. And I'll make one correction to my bio. I worked for the Navy, but I was not in the Navy. And I say that because I have the utmost respect for people who wear a uniform. And I haven't earned it, so I won't be described that way.
It was my error.
That's all right, that's all right. I do come from a military family. I've been around the Navy and Marine Corps for a lot of years, but I haven't worn the uniform. I am an engineer. I've had a great 10-year effort working with ambulance manufacturers, different members of the end user community in the work that I'm going to share with you. And you're going to get a snippet of what we've done, but what we hope we're doing is helping the industry build a safer vehicle for all the users. We're working together collaboratively today. Had another meeting today, in fact, talking about standards with many different members of the community. So what we set out to do was, on some levels, I think, fairly fundamental. We wanted to be able to bring the patient compartment of an ambulance up to the same basic crash standard level that you have for your automobile, SUV, van. And most people don't realize that the ambulances fall outside of those crash safety regulations, not so much because they're an ambulance, but simply because of the size of the vehicle. And for any of you that traveled here, I'm sure you had the opportunity to ride in some kind of a shuttle bus or van. Probably, if it was a larger bus, didn't have a seat belt, might have had a side-facing seat, luggage on an open rack. None of that would fly if you compare it to your basic automotive standards. And so what we've tried to do is think in terms of what really constitutes a safer installation and look at component by component the back of the ambulance patient compartment. We wanted to work with end users to make sure what we were working on actually made sense. Near term, we've developed a family of specific test standards. So everything I'm going to show you is really how do you test a seat? How do you test a patient cot or an equipment mount? And long term, we wanted those rolled into bumper-to-bumper style standards. So you'll hear component-specific standards, cot, seat, equipment mount, and bumper-to-bumper, that's like the triple K spec that you might be familiar with today, or the NFPA 1917, or if you've heard the new CAS GVS 2015 document that's coming out. All three of those are bumper-to-bumper documents that talk about wiring, mechanical devices, paint, anything you can think of for specifying an ambulance. But I'm going to talk about component-specific items. So that was our near-term goal, come up with the component-specific. Long-term goal is to get it referenced in these larger documents that you would all use. And most importantly, and this was really key to our partnership, is whatever we came up with as a group, we wanted to test. We wanted to prove you could do it before we wrote a requirement that said you had to do it. So what were we really talking about, and where were our areas to improve? This pair of photos are what I'll use as a before and after. They're two different ambulances built by the same manufacturer in the same ambulance service. The one on the right was involved in a 90-degree roll, so it was struck broadside by a passenger vehicle, went off the road, rolled on its side. The one on the left is a sister ambulance in the same service, set up in the same manner. You can see the view on the right. The cot has come out of the antler mount. It's overturned. Most of the equipment and supplies have come out of the cabinet. In some other views, there are problems up at the front end with cabinets as well, and partitions that have come apart. So those were all areas that we thought we could improve. I come from a worker safety background, so all of these are hazards to the worker, of course. They're also hazards to the patient as well. When we started thinking about design, I mentioned before we wanted design to the same level as your car. You'll hear me refer to 30 miles per hour. That's what your car is designed to, but this isn't 30 miles an hour driving through your neighborhood and hitting somebody in a T-bone. That's more actually like about a 10 to 12 mile an hour crash, because you still slide through the intersection. What I'm talking about is 30 to 0 into a concrete wall, which is the same way your car is tested. So it's a much higher energy crash. We chose that. I mean, we could have said, why not 60? We drive a lot faster in an ambulance. But frankly, you see the car at 60 miles an hour, it's not likely to be survivable. We weren't trying to over-design or design your vehicles to a higher level. Again, we're trying to match the automotive side. So we went out and crashed some ambulances. We did 3 frontal crash tests, that's the upper left-hand picture, 4 side impact tests, and we used the same side impact test procedures that are used for the Insurance Institute. When you hear a 4 or 5-star crash rating, we use that same methodology. We employed it for 2 rear impacts, that's the bottom left-hand corner, and we also did 3 roll tests, plus another style of roll done by the European Union. So all of that became input. We had to know what happened when a vehicle crashed, what kind of energy did we see on the floor, so we could design things that attach to the floor in a individual component perspective. So if I look at one of those frontal crashes, these are 2 stills. I have a video in a minute, but you see in that 30 mile an hour frontal crash, there's a lot of damage to the ambulance itself, but the patient compartment largely stays intact. That's good news. I mean, we want to keep that space intact to provide you space to safely operate. But on the right-hand side, the inside of that ambulance, the cot comes off the floor. The patient, if you're unrestrained, slams into the front wall. So there are opportunities for improvement. A little loud, but that's that crash. We ran 3 of those, 3 different ambulances, all production ambulances. One came in the day before it was crashed. It had just come right out of service. That was donated. And in each of those, we instrumented the floor of the ambulance and the roof so we could understand what happens in the floor. Here's the inside. You can see the first occupant blew through the net. You could make that net strong enough, but there's no standard on how strong it needs to be and how the floor fastener needs to be. I'm going to run it again. The cot is a standard antler cot. It was tethered at the foot end. We expected it was going to come out, so it would have completely overturned had we not tethered it, but we didn't want to break all the instrumentation. And these are actual crash test dummies that you'd see in an automotive test. So we had opportunities. We also, when we looked at the cot, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, we recognized that even the shoulder harnesses, although they're not often used, I'm going to encourage you to use them no matter which cot you have, the shoulder harness is attached off the top end of the cot. And so you have all of this space where you're not really engaging the shoulder. And you can see in this bottom photo, the patient occupant slides all the way into the rear-facing attendant. Here's a video that shows that. I've actually met a worker with a fractured pelvis and know of at least another that experienced this head-to-crotch event. So when we started thinking about the cot, we not only wanted it staying attached to the floor, but we wanted to do a better job of keeping the occupant on the cot without so much travel. So I actually worked with Furno and Stryker on this committee, as well as some independent test labs. We came up with some basic requirements. One, we were going to dynamically test these cots, which means we're going to crash test the cots. And both companies participated. Both companies have products that now meet this test standard. We also wanted to reduce the excursion of the patient on the cot so that that patient wouldn't get into that worker in the rear-facing seat. Now, we came up with a limit of 14 inches. Both manufacturers have cots and revised restraint systems that meet that requirement. And I would encourage you to talk to each cot supplier about their products. Also, we're using the same crash test dummy that is used in automotive testing through all of these tests that I'm going to talk about. And in this case, the dummy was safely restrained on the patient cot without exceeding any of the limits that we would also use when we test a car seat. So there are actually limits for neck load, head acceleration, things like that, and we applied those same limits to the cot. We, of course, wanted to look at seating. I'm a worker-centered organization. We wanted to make sure you had better seats, so we crash tested seats. Actually, we probably ran about 150 seat system tests. In this case, you're seeing 2 tests. But if a seat was forward-facing, the manufacturer now is required to test that seat forward-facing. If it can rotate and be rear-facing, that same seat has to be tested in a rear-facing position. If it rotates to a lock at a 45 or at a 90, a side-facing position, it also needs to be tested in those orientations. We had 3 different seat manufacturers that partnered with us, and 3 different restraint manufacturers that partnered with us. We also tested different restraints on bench seats. So what I can tell you is, use the same crash test dummy, dynamically tested to the same crash loads that you'd see equivalents in your car. You have new seats that are out there on the market that will meet these crash requirements. Equipment mounts. Nothing too dramatic here unless a mount breaks. But one of the first fatalities we looked at, an EMS worker was killed by an oxygen cylinder. How many have put an oxygen cylinder on the cot between a patient's legs? Anybody in here ever done that? And how well do you think it's secured? It becomes that missile or that torpedo if there's a crash event. You don't have to hit something. Even slamming on the brakes, that oxygen cylinder can become a projectile, just like all the junk we have in our cars, sitting on seats or in that back window area. So our goal here was to say, if you're going to have equipment and you're going to have it outside of a cabinet, you ought to have an equipment mount. Well, that sounds great, but let's test that mount and make sure it'll hold up to the same crash loads as the seat, as the cot. No sense having a great interior if all I'm going to do is put a bunch of torpedoes in there to hit me. So whether it's a fire extinguisher, an AED, a suction unit, bariatric winch, a safe, doesn't matter. All of these things should be tested. And we have a couple of different test methods, a dynamic test, which is a crash-like test. For these, because they're smaller and the companies tend to be smaller, we also created a static test, which is a straight pull. You don't have to go to a crash test facility to do it. We have additional work that's going on right now. We're also looking at the body structure. That's not quite complete. In fact, our committee is meeting in 2 weeks. So we're trying to improve the tests that the ambulance builders already do on their body structure. Cabinets and latching, that one's near and dear to my heart. You remember that early picture when all of the equipment was outside the cabinets after the rollover? We want to change that. Again, we want to think of it as a system. We're putting together a puzzle. Interior surface delethalization. I'll tip my hat to my Navy days. We want to make the surfaces less likely to hurt you. Some of you may have seen a video on YouTube where a dummy's head hits a cabinet and folds underneath. That's some of our early work. We want to make those surfaces less likely to hurt you, whether it's a sidewall or a cabinet. So if I know where your head's going to go on the seat in a crash, let's make that sidewall softer. And that's more than just thin padding. That's even changing the construction of the wall. Think about a stud in your house. I'm not one that really wants to punch my wall too often, but if I'm going to punch it, I hope I hit between the studs, not on the studs. A lot of energy change if I can change the wall. And the last one, EMS worker anthropometry. We're out there actually measuring EMS workers. We've been to 6 of 8 sites so far. There is a hypothesis that EMS workers might be larger than the general population. If that's true, shouldn't we size our seats, our gear that we wear to fit that worker? We've done this kind of work already with firefighters, truck drivers, farmers, and we have found distinct differences between different trades. And so we're doing that with the EMS workers as well. We have 2 more sites. They'll be done this spring. So I think this is probably my last slide. I talked earlier about a bumper-to-bumper standard, GSA purchase specification, NFPA 1917, CAS GVS 2015. They're all bumper-to-bumper standards, or in the case of the GSA, a purchase spec. Our goal is to reference each of these component items into those documents. So I'm very happy to say the ellipses that are green are all completed published test standards that we've published with the Society of Automotive Engineers. And each of those are referenced today in drafts of each of the 3 bumper-to-bumper standards, GSA purchase spec, NFPA 1917, and CAS GVS 2015. We're finishing those that are yellow and blue. I expect that they'll all be in the publication mode before the end of this year, and I hope to have them referenced as well in those bumper-to-bumper standards. So I'm hoping that these new pieces of equipment come to you by way of future purchases. We're not talking about retrofitting anybody's ambulance. We're not talking about changes in that structure, but they would come with future purchases. So as you replace an ambulance in 2016, regardless of the bumper-to-bumper standard that you choose, if you choose the latest versions of those, you'll get these new seats and cots and equipment mounts. And that's part, we're going to eventually turn it back to Dia, and she's going to talk about standards and adoption. But that's part of this whole puzzle too, is the state level and the adoption level. But we're all working in the same direction to get these safer products to you. With that, that's my last little slide. I am going to turn it over to Dia Gaynor to come back up and tell us how the state's going to fix this problem.
Oh, thank you, Professor.
She's here to help us.
Ambulance design for the vast majority of states has been a regulatory matter since the early 1970s, and it was a big part of why the KKK purchasing specification published by the General Services Administration was such a handy tool, because back then there were still a number of ambulance services using things like hearses as ambulances, so the KKK presented a very convenient way for states to grab it, and in their role of licensing EMS agencies, including requirements for the design of ambulances, to just do something called incorporation by reference. Just point to the KKK specification and say, if you want to use a vehicle as an ambulance in this state, it's got to be built to this specification. And state EMS offices are in that regulatory role for a variety of other reasons. Hopefully most of you are familiar with those staff and the functions they perform, setting educational standards, licensing EMS personnel, the all-important data collection, trauma system regulation, et cetera. They're also responsible for enforcement and things like inspections, and that ties in with the ambulance design issues as well. The last time we asked the state EMS offices to count the number of ambulance services and report it centrally in the United States, we came up with about 14,500 ground EMS agencies that transport patients. That is a lot of organizations. And so I'm sharing these data with you in the interest of understanding how big the footprint is of any potential changes in design of ambulance services. And a year later, we asked states to tell us sort of where they fell as far as their regulatory approach was concerned. Did they incorporate the KKK specs in whole or part in their state rules? Did they adopt KKK specs as a matter of policy? Did they regulate design without using the KKK specs? Did they have no design regulation, or were they in other? And what we found, and the reason why we only asked about KKK was that this survey predated the emergence of NFPA 1917 and CAS GVS 2015. We learned that only 6 states do not regulate the design of ambulances at all. There are about 13 that regulate it without using the KKK spec at all. This shows only one state as other, but we've since found a second other. In New Mexico, the State Public Utility Commission, of all things, regulates ambulance design. But we did find that 30 or so states regulate design using either the KKK spec in their entirety or in part. And so this is what the country looks like. New Mexico should be yellow. We have 1 or 2 states, Utah being one, and possibly others, who, and this is really the big trigger issue, as the GSA has announced that they are likely to retire the KKK spec as of September 30th of this year, this becomes really suddenly gravidly important for states that have dependency on that KKK spec because they properly can no longer incorporate it by reference once it no longer exists. So if that's the case, and GSA does retire the KKK spec, then essentially what else do we have to think about that's different? Jim's portion of the presentation that he just mentioned references tests. The Ambulance Manufacturers Division of the National Truck Equipment Association historically was the only source for crash or other testing related to ambulance design to make sure that as constructed, it would really hold up the way it was meant to hold up. And those AMD tests were often incorporated into the KKK spec as each new generation of the KKK spec was published, and that's when they would get a new letter. Now we see something called change orders associated with the KKK specs, but again, if they only exist through September of this year, we have to begin to get an understanding, both as state agencies, but also among all of you, whether you're in a role purchasing ambulances or have a role functioning in ambulances, that's really important to understand, which is if now the Society of Automotive Engineering is a source of new and additional and very important tests, we have to begin to understand the possibility that as those new tests emerge, one or more of the other ambulance design standards may not yet have incorporated that new test. And so the rule promulgation, whether it's to change an existing rule in your state administrative code that does reference KKK now, that process takes a long time. Generally speaking, unless somebody can declare an emergency, it can be months and of process and an expensive one at that. And also when states can start rulemaking varies by state as well. So there's no way for me to do a single presentation up here and tell you what month and year your state can change their rules, let alone how the state might change its rules. That's something I encourage you to explore with your state EMS office. And your question for the state EMS office is, what are you going to do? If we're a state that regulates ambulance design, where are we going with this issue? Well, your state has the option of getting out of the business of regulating ambulance design. Certainly have heard from the lion's share of ambulance manufacturers suggesting that would be a really bad idea. Because in the absence of any regulation of that design, the fear is that some organizations, ambulance manufacturers, may choose to do things like cut corners that directly affect safety that may not be visible to the human eye. It's also possible that the state could incorporate one or more alternative design standards by reference, like they used to with the KKK, but now point to NFPA 1917 or CAS GVS 2015 or both. It's also possible your state may be thinking about incorporating them by reference, those design specs, but then also leaving the door open to mandating SAE tests if they are concerned about how rapidly those new tests could get incorporated into the design standard. Has anybody ever participated in EMS rulemaking at the state level? Okay, yeah, I can tell by both of your faces, neither pretty or fun. Your state has choices. It can be something they initiate because they realize, we better get a move on. If it looks like the KKK is actually getting retired, we've got some rules to change. So they can start it internally. But it's also very quite common for there to be a mechanism by which affected parties can petition the state, hey, we need to go in and change these rules. When the request is filed about, well, why does this rule need to change, it often requires some documentation about the rationale and implications for the change. Like I mentioned, it may qualify for emergency rulemaking that allows it to be done the rulemaking to be done on a more expedited basis. But very importantly, requests for rulemaking, whether initiated internally or eventually when initiated externally, have to include a fiscal impact statement. It has to show what the difference will be in terms of cost, either to the state or to the agencies being regulated, or to both, as a result of adoption of these modified rules. And state rule promulgation also includes testimony in front of might be a legislative committee or a board or a commission. So whoever's getting up to testify really has to have enough knowledge and understanding about the importance and the ramifications, et cetera, to be able to speak intelligently to the issue. Your state EMS office, along with the other 55 state and territorial offices in the United States, have a lot in common. First and foremost, the safety of EMS crews and their patients, and frankly, in that order. State EMS offices, by definition, exist to protect the public. So clearly, this falls into that realm and makes it a concern. They're also very sensitive to system stability and the possibility that a more expensive ambulance may be a very big and real hardship, especially for rural and volunteer services. The states need a defensible basis for the new rules. So regardless of whether it starts internally or externally, they have to be able to be in a position of telling a compelling story about why the rule change is needed and the fiscal impact. But ultimately, the states have historically been interested in a true minimum standard, in the sense that the state is really not in a position of, nor would they be able to defend cosmetic issues, for example, related to an ambulance. So we've committed to developing model rules. It's something that our organization does on a regular basis when an issue of national significance comes up, for which either there are no rules today, or for which the outdated set of rules that somehow almost everybody still has on the books should go away and be replaced with something else. And with that, I'm turning the floor over to Mr. Kirkwood.
This is musical chairs. Thank you. And a good time was had by all. Hello, everybody. So I got involved in this on the request of the president of the National Association of EMTs. So instead of my usual management hat, I'm involved in the current CAS process, and by virtue of that, this larger issue, trying to be the voice of the folks in the field who have to work in these vehicles. I also come from one of those gray states where the state doesn't regulate ambulance design, and our trucks seem to work pretty good. So I don't know what that means. But I was asked today to talk about what this means for the end user. So the NAEMT's got 40,000 members, and we're supposed to look out for their interests and for the interests of the other, I don't know, 960,000 EMTs who don't pay their dues and don't belong to the association. So my interest in this is an ambulance that's functional and it's safe and it incorporates all the great work that Jim and his folks have done in trying to keep this environment that we work in something that we can survive, something that it's not a question of if we're going to have ambulance crashes, it's going to be a question of when and how often and how we do when we have them. So just while we're all here, let's put our hands together and thank Jim for his work. Because this guy's devoted a whole lot of years and a whole lot of hours and a whole lot of uncompensated time coming to conferences to make our workspace better, and that's a really important thing. So Dia talked a little bit about the state regulatory environment, and I'm a recovering state EMS director. I was the director in Oregon from 1991 to 1996 and learned to live with these things. And I started out working with the triple K specification, and that's an important word because the triple K document never started out to be a design standard for ambulances. It was a federal purchasing specification. It was the document that said when the federal government buys ambulances for itself, here's what they want. Hence, the requirement that was in that document for a long time about white with a 12-inch Omaha orange stripe around the outside. Not because there was any magic to that, but because that's what the federal government decided they wanted. And as we've gone through the NFPA process and the CAS GVS 2015 process, we keep going back to the difference between standard and specification. If it's something that the purchaser can decide that relates to the way the purchaser does business, or simply their preferences about what color the floor should be in the back of the ambulance, those don't belong in a standard. Those belong in the purchasing specification. And the truth was, back in the early 70s and late 60s, we had the A version of the triple K standard, and it was just easy because there's a lot of stuff in that book if you ever had it. And rather than go and try and parse it out and suss it out and figure what's there, we'd adopt the book. And there are still states in this country where your ambulance must be white with an Omaha orange stripe. But over the years, people in the business in 50 states and a few territories and decided that maybe they wanted their ambulances a little differently. And working with, or sometimes against, their state regulatory agencies, through this rulemaking process Dia described, they started taking exception to stuff. So the state would say, we adopt KKK, the B version, except page 26, where it talks about colors, page 32, where it says what kind of seat cushion it's going to have, page 33, it says where a coffee cup holder. And you would have one paragraph adopting and then 32 paragraphs taking exceptions to it. So we're moving now toward this standard, and that's probably a good thing. But until the federal government announced it was going out of the specification business, and that came about because President Obama issued an executive order that said if there's a non-governmental organization setting standards, then the federal government should get out of the business. So the triple K became I don't know, casualty is the right word, but became a victim of that executive order. But that's still out there, and a state could go pick and choose and pull paragraphs and use that as a basis for its rules. That's just a lot of process to talk about. When you put out a rule as a state EMS director, you want it to be about a paragraph. Because if it's really long, then people start taking it apart. It costs you a lot of time and money to work with it. A couple of years ago, the NFPA decided that they were going to issue a standard for ambulances. And there was a process, and they adopted a standard that went into effect on January 2013. And they're actually getting ready to start the revision process. Staying as apolitical as I possibly can, it is worth noting that this has been out there for 2 years and no state has adopted it into their rules yet. There is stuff, a lot of the stuff in there looks more like a purchasing specification than a design standard. For example, it says what color the chevrons that you may or may not wish to have on the back of your ambulance ought to be. So that's out there. And of course, there's discussion about whether there should be any alternatives to that. So with the state directors faced with Triple K retiring, doing a whole lot of work to invent their own standards, and 50 states doing that independently would not be pretty. With the NFPA standard out there being a little controversial, a coalition was formed, and I'm going to suspect that this was under the leadership of the state officials, but the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Services agreed to undertake a standards development process. We did some work last year. Public comment was accepted through December 1st of 2014. We just finished reviewing 2 hours ago the last of the public comment. We got a lot of public comment, and it was good stuff. The draft includes the new SAE standards, for which I'm really grateful. We're hoping to get it out sometime in the spring of this year, but we have to go through another round of public comment and revision. And you can go on the web to see what it says in groundvehiclestandard.org. It is thinner than what you might be used to, because we've been very careful to keep out the specification stuff and leave it as a standard. But it doesn't, all the ovals that Jim had up there on the thing with the arrows, we made real sure that those evidence-based, scientifically based test standards are built in there for all of our safety. There's some other things out there. The existing, there's an ASTM standard for the design, construction, and procurement of EMS ambulances. There is no indication, and there was a meeting, I guess the meeting occurred yesterday, maybe the day before, but no indication that the ASTM was thinking about including the SAE standards. So I'm not seeing that as being a viable document going forward. This slide shows the timing. The K-spec existed. There's changes happening there, but mid 2015, late 2015, we'll start seeing the final iteration of CAS's standard and the second version of the NFPA standard. So I'm going to go through these real quick because Jim showed most of them, but we're going to have the patient and litter restraint standard, that cot coming loose and or the patient breaking loose from the belt. Watching that pelvic explosion thing is particularly painful, so we won't do that again. The seating standard, the equipment mount standard. This is a new one and a really good one, because if you've been in a crash, or have seen the results of a crash, that those 10 and 12 and 15-pound objects flying around the back of the ambulance pick up a certain amount of velocity before they hit you in the head and take you out. And having the equipment mounted is I think, going to be real good for us. Patient compartment integrity, that's of course important. The cabinet and latch standard, Jim had some videos he didn't show a lot of, doing some cabinet testing. But when you put your suction machine in a cabinet that doesn't meet the standard, and then you hit that with a pulse from the side, and the suction machine comes out and obliterates itself and the person that's in its path, it's not good either. So we want all this stuff in our standards for our own safety. So what's this mean? What do you think it means? It's going to make the ambulance cheaper? Probably not. Like most small businesses, and you may be surprised when I consider ambulance building and construction a small business. But I was having a discussion with somebody about chassis. You know, chassis come and chassis go, and it dawned on me a couple of years ago, the police industry was really annoyed that the Crown Victoria went away. And the cops didn't understand why Ford wouldn't keep on making that car, because they wanted it. And the police services in the United States, federal, state, county, local, buy about 100,000 units a year, 100,000 police cars bought in a year. You know what the total market for new ambulances in the United States in a year? About 7,000 units. So we are not going to influence a major motor vehicle manufacturer to do chassis, especially for us. Things are going to move. So making existing chassis is going to raise the price some, and we all know about some. The good news is people have been paying attention to Jim and his group's work for quite some time. They have been developing products to meet the SAE standards. Last year, I decided I couldn't say safety was my biggest priority and still have stretchers in antlers in my ambulances. So I went and found the money and did a safety initiative to put the crash-tested cot mount in my ambulance. If you've been down in the exhibit hall, you saw my new ambulance that has the crash-tested seats in them. And we're looking very much forward to crash-tested cabinets as well. There's some other interesting stuff going on. And when we go to these meetings, we have Jim and then we have Jennifer. And Jennifer works for another federal agency, and she is an ergonomist. Well, what's an ergonomist? Well, they're concerned with human performance and reaching and, you know, how far your head can travel and motion of the human body. Fascinating stuff. And they're working on how it would be best to design an ambulance patient compartment. Why do we have a squad bench in the ambulance? 41 years, I don't know. Because that's the way we've always done it, right? Why does the attendant sit on the curb side of the ambulance? It's the wrong place, I'm here to tell you, for starting an IV for the 80% of the population that's right-handed. But we've always done it that way. So Jennifer's work is fascinating. And I shamelessly stole her slides, but they're just doing some cool stuff. They want us to be able to take care of the patient, imagine this, to reach the patient from their knees to the top of their head and do the stuff we have to do while we're sitting down, belted in. Novel concept, right? Stop us from becoming missiles, and be able to face and interact the patient while we're going down the street. So they've been measuring this anthropometric study that Jim talked about. They want to know what we need to do so we can put that seat there and have anyone from a 5th percentile female to a 95th percentile male be able to sit in that space and do their job. And they've been doing computer modeling and design and just some really cool stuff that you'll start to see reflected in vehicle design. This is a two-sided center mount, Conceptual Design. The monitor is in a crash-tested mount. The chairs make it so that the providers can face forward. There's a side view of it. Note that the provider facing forward is kind of sitting at a desk. Imagine that. You could look at your patient, talk to him, write a report, and type on a computer, all the while being seat belted in. So they used computer simulation analysis and models, and there's the mannequins, and there's the people, and that's what some of the stuff starts to look like. One side and the other. Interestingly, as new computers come in, a lot of these requirements start to change, because when you get away from a 12-pound tough book to a 2-pound Surface that has a much smaller footprint, you start gaining room and things start changing even more. This, I'm not going to do this to you. If you want this, somebody send me an email. I'll send you the chart. This just goes through the three different standards and compares how they approach a variety of issues. Some of them very different, some of them not terribly different, but too much to mess with here. There will be a cost impact, and incremental cost will vary based on what you order and what it is you're buying now. Some folks buy very expensive ambulances already, and the incremental cost to put in a crash-tested cot mount, for example, might not be very much. I've heard numbers ranging from $7,000 to $20,000 to put all this new stuff in there. Is that about the same thing you were hearing? Yeah, and you know, that's not bad. It seems terrible, but if you run a service and you've had anybody bad hurt or killed, we can fix up and upgrade a lot of ambulances for the cost of one serious line of duty injury or death. Seating depends on your specifications. The big one is the cot. This slide says $16,000 to $40,000. I think those numbers are high based on the age of the information. I think you can negotiate those prices down quite a bit. And I know that I just brought my whole fleet into compliance with a stretcher and a crash-tested track, and it was about $17,000 a vehicle. Equipment mounts, depending on where you put your stuff, how you do it. I want that monitor tied down, because when I slam on the brakes, that's a 14-pound missile that could probably hurt somebody pretty good. I am done, and I'm going to guess my friend Jay has some questions for us.
I do. Actually, I don't have questions for you. You have answers for your questions. And so what I'd like to do is ask Jerry Sosha, who has a portable mic. He'll roam the room. And who's got the first question that might want to pose to this august panel? Because I think there's been lots of stuff talked about, but I think we need to dive a little deeper before we let you out of the room.
Well, while people are thinking of their question, I have a declaration.
I was going to
make.
say, I'm okay with silence, but go ahead, Dia.
And that is that my colleague Skip speculated that the CAS initiative was at the state EMS director's urging, and it was not. We were invited just as we were invited to join the NFPA process.
Okay, well, there you go. I thought I saw a hand over here, Jared.
Or Jim, the testing labs that are authorized to perform
Thank you. That sounds much better. The testing labs that are approved or authorized to conduct those pulse tests on a new ambulance design or a new cot mount or a new equipment mount, are those identified by your organization, and what would be an estimated cost to run a battery of those tests?
Well, We do not certify any one lab, but those labs exist all around the country and are available. So if I were to do a crash type test and utilize the lab for a day, and a cot setup takes us about a day to do all of the setup, run the test, and tear it down. It's about $3,000 per cot test. Occasionally, we were able to get 2 tests in a day for the cot. Now, for a seat, you could actually, you saw 2 seats on one of those tests. I've run as many as 4 seats at a time. So if you had a seat that was forward-facing, side-facing, rear-facing, locked at a 45, I could run all 3 of those at the same time for close to that same price, plus the cost of the seats themselves. And that's renting dummies and that type of thing.
Great question.
Equipment mounts, if you were a company that sold equipment mounts, you could do 10 or 12 at one time in a half a day probably. So, and every lab will charge you a little differently, but there are labs coast to coast that can be authorized to do this testing.
Needless to say, it gets pretty expensive when what you're crashing is a whole truck.
Yeah. Well, and that's a different experience. I will say crashing a whole truck, besides the cost of the truck, was about a $25,000 test. By the time we instrumented it, all the video work, that type of thing. I mean, just to rent the cameras for some of that high-speed work was $1,000 each. So it adds up fast if you're doing that.
Who's got the next question? Orange shirt, Jerry, back in the back.
My question was, did you, probably for the engineer, did you have any tests about the LED standards? Everything's gone LED now, both in the interior compartments and the warning lights. Is there anything tested?
No, I haven't done any work with lighting, interior or exterior.
Okay. Is anybody?
I'm going to throw the question back to Steve. He may know that better than anyone here. Do you know of or lighting standard or test standards that we're relating to these?
I'm Steve Rowland with Furno. I work in our ambulance systems group, and I think the only there's an SAEJ 2498 test or recommended practice for emergency vehicle lighting. It coincides pretty closely with an NFPA standard that's out there and with the CAS references that SAE 2498 as well. What's missing from it is a recommended maximum brightness. I think the industry has not accomplished that, although many of the manufacturers have saw the need to put in dimming circuitry into the lighting equipment. But as far as the amount of light you need in the forward, rear, and side-facing zones, and the standard also talks about 2 modes of operation, one for calling for the right-of-way when you're moving, the other for blocking the right-of-way when you're stationary. That would probably be the closest thing to a standard that's out there. And it's pretty conclusive from as the length of the vehicle changes, it adds in midship lighting and other stuff, so it encompasses from larger, longer apparatus from command vehicles and fire trucks down to smaller ambulances.
Good question. Another question? All right, then back and then up front.
Dia, would there be a possibility for NASEMSO to generate like a talking points sheet or something on that we could urge our states to adopt the crash documentation portion of the to include ambulances in their state reporting systems, or is that something that needs to be done from a federal basis down? Or
That's kind of a touchy subject because a sister association to ours, the Governor's Highway Safety Association, regards that as their jurisdiction. So
No politics involved in this at all, right?
So for us to arm, while we certainly have had direct conversations with GHSA on this subject, for us to arm individuals to go attack another association, to talk to another association's members, would be kind of viewed as poor form.
Thank you. To the crash test data, you mentioned that there was a breakdown between emergency and non-emergency response. However, what I've learned over the years is that federal, state, county and even cities and municipalities, everyone seems to have different protocols for responding to and from. The other protocols are different on how they do that. So you run into certain cities that don't allow them to go code 3 unless they upgrade, quiet code 2 to the hospital unless it's traumatic. Was there any breakdown by county, city, or state that kind of defines whether some of those protocols save more lives or cause a higher rate of injury?
That's a great question. I don't know of any work along those lines that has been done. However, there is certainly interest in making those data more robust so that that very kind of work could be done. One of the other changes that was made in the most recent version of MUC, and you can just Google MMUCC 4.0, it's the latest version, was that we completely overhauled the emergency, non-emergency variables and their definitions, because just saying emergency, non-emergency wasn't telling us enough to get at what you're describing, that in fact they were in a response mode, as far as they were committed to a call, but not using lights and sirens. So we got into, I think it's 5 different categories now. The trick will be getting the law enforcement officers to correctly identify which of those 5 modes the ambulance was actually in.
From the perspective of a system designer and someone who works with city and county managers all over the country, we're certainly seeing, kind of to your point, much more interest in titrating the response, as opposed to I dialed 911 and we play dump the house, and everybody runs lights and sirens. And that's really becoming less common today, again, simply because of risk management. And the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch have done some research relative to the difference in response time, and I don't recall the exact number of seconds between
43.
43, thank you, Skip, 43-second difference between a call to the same address that dispatched, lights and sirens versus non-lights and sirens. So we kind of have this mentality, and certainly our law enforcement colleagues have come to that realization as well, that when somebody flips on lights and sirens, blood pressure goes up. Some of the components of do we make good decisions and do we manage our own risk well, not so much. So there's certainly, I think the data that we're looking at over time is going to have to get segmented a lot differently to be able to account for those factors, because in fact, I think we're going to see less emergency responses to calls.
So here's the trick, ladies and gentlemen. There's no place written, and besides being a recovering state EMS director, I'm a recovering lawyer. And as I travel around, one of the things I look at is emergency vehicle codes. And I haven't yet found one where it says you turn the emergency warning systems on and the next thing you're supposed to do is drive really fast. Had the discussion the other day because we had in North Carolina a small amount of snow is a very big deal. And somebody said, well, maybe we should run cold to all the calls. And bad visibility and some of that, maybe having a few more blinkies is maybe a good thing. But driving fast surely is not. So going down that path, a guy named Greg Fries from EMS1.com got a hold of me, and we're going to do a little article about driver training. And anybody in EMS in the United States had a driver training course that was longer than 2 days? All the courses that we give are 2 days. If you go over to London and you want to drive an ambulance, 6 weeks on the road driver training, right? So we're undertrained, and in many cases we are overdosed with adrenaline. But I don't know of a SOG or a medical protocol or a dispatch protocol that says drive really fast.
A couple more questions here.
In a lot of cases, I'm from LA County, where in a lot of cases, they give the determination of code 3 to the paramedic in the back based on And most of the time, he wants to get there fast, get back to bed, so he's gonna, utilize something that the 19-year-old driving in the front, we put a lot of emphasis on very, very young kids to do this, and it's always been a concern of mine. Orange County, for instance, as opposed to LA County, has totally different protocols as far as their response, and I'm very interested to know what their data is on, accidents and such, if there was a way of breaking it down at some point, but it doesn't sound like it.
One of the things that we're going to see more of, you're going to be hearing a new word more often. You're going to be hearing about vehicle telematics. They're going to be dumping your black box and your engine control computer. And if somebody's interested, they'll be able to find out what that vehicle was doing at the time. And the little story we tell them about how the deer jumped out and committed suicide will maybe not hold up so well.
So I think the research and the testing on the crash survivability is fantastic. Are there implementations in the future to talk about crash avoidance and things that we're doing to help that sort of aspect?
There may well be. Right now, I'm not aware of it, and well, all right, sounds like Dia has the answer. I'll let her answer.
There is a very concerted effort to inject ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, and towing and highway incident response trucks into the thinking of something called the Intelligent Transportation Systems Connected Vehicle Initiative. The U.S. Department of Transportation is investing very, very heavily in, you'll hear the acronyms V to V and V to I, vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to infrastructure communications, happening wirelessly and automatically along the roadways. And our concern, because those are directly related to collision avoidance, is that the paradigms and the operational scenarios and the deployment plans that have emerged so far assume that all vehicles have equal rights, if you will, and that and have not yet actively contemplated how perhaps those vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure systems should work differently with an emergency response vehicle that does have a legitimate need to sort of overpower another vehicle on the road,
Well,
or to avoid hitting another vehicle on the road.
there are technologies today that are in place. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for example, you'd think Sioux Falls, but it's the largest city in South Dakota, right? About 85% of their intersections are light controlled, and they had the same issue with the first generation of their traffic control system. They only allowed the fire department to utilize it because of the weight and mass of the vehicles. They didn't want to have a police car or an ambulance, entering the same intersection from a different place or having the confusion. But the next generation, the new generation of traffic control information prioritizes that, so it actually will accommodate that. But believe it or not, as we designed the ambulance specs for that community, there was resistance from the providers saying, gee, that's $4,500 per unit that we might have to invest in. And I was very proud of the city manager and the mayor of the city who said, and that's what we're going to do. So I think we have to be prepared. Skip made the point that some of this is going to have an increased cost, but the increased cost is a small cost in the bigger picture. I think we got one more question, and then I've got a couple final comments here.
Yeah, just two comments. One, regarding the driver training 6-week program in the UK. If they would just drive on the correct side of the road, it wouldn't take so long.
There you go. All right.
But specifically to the timeline that you outlined with Triple K, the revision 7, on or about the 1st of July, or effective date 1st of July, and then Triple K retiring just a few months later as the CAS GVS emerges to take its place. Is that my understanding of what the federal government is telling us, the General Services Administration right now, that it will officially retire later this year?
the September 30th, 2015 retirement date was the last date announced by the GSA, but their representative has occasionally conceded in public meetings recently that, that may or may not be the date.
Okay, I mean, it takes, in most cases, more than 90 days to buy an ambulance. And those that are specifying and going to bid for ambulances into this summer months, how can, you know, they can't reference a spec that isn't going to exist at the time the vehicle is built. Or, and so I'm just kind of looking for when are they obligated, if any, to lock down those timelines?
They're really not obligated by anything. Remember, that document, when you move on to federal territory, is not a reference document for states. It's how they're going to buy their ambulances. And you know what? They're still going to have some document that says they're going to buy their ambulances because they're going to have to tell the dealers what color to make them and stuff. When you do your buying, you'll be locking in a vehicle when you do your buying. And you'll be able to use whatever is available. And even though, for example, the CAS standard hasn't been adopted by anybody yet, I can go to my dealer and say, build me this ambulance.
But no ambulance manufacturer has an ambulance that they've sent to an independent lab and certified to that standard, right? Will there be that type of third-party testing as we've become accustomed to with Triple K?
Oh, there's plenty of folks out there who have done those tests. A couple of them were just adopted weeks ago, maybe a month ago. So nobody has done some of them. But for example, the J3027 for the cot, people have been having that tested for
And I apologize for taking the extra time, but Triple K testing, I've been in the business 30 years, is type and model specific. So you'd have a Ford Type 2, a Chevy Type 1, et cetera, et cetera. So each configuration would have to be independently certified by that lab, the manufacturer, in order to put a case sticker on that vehicle and represent to the buyer so that the local state inspector could sign it in and permit it in that state. That whole chain has to be intact in order for all the legalities. Dia knows what I'm talking about. And there's going to be a break in that chain that's just going to leave everyone hanging based on what I'm hearing here.
Well, not only that, but in some states where the legislature only meets every 2 years, guess what? You know, to get a regulation passed, we're already past the time frame. So we're going to have, I think it's fair to say, we're going to have to deal with in any change process, we have to live with some irregularities and some things. I think, again, if I were in a state that had a standard that had adopted, I would make sure that what I was buying, even with the expiration of the other standard, at least met that standard, the historic standard, until a new standard was approved. I'm not a recovering lawyer, but even good common sense would tell you that's good risk management in terms of avoiding getting sued, to at least be at that standard or a higher level of standard rather than lower. I really want to thank Furno for creating the sponsorship of this this afternoon and our panel this afternoon. There are some Furno representatives that are in the room that if you've got some other individual questions, because they've been deeply engaged in some of the design of some of the cot protection and some of the other aspects of improving vehicle safety and our worker safety, and they'll be glad to try to answer your specific questions if you've got those. So thank you, panel. We appreciate it.